So in this video, we'll look at questions that involve identifying sentence roles. We've gotten a good head start on this, hopefully, in our previous videos where we've made a point of identifying the role that each sentence plays in terms of whether it's a conclusion, a premise, a counter premise, etc. And as we'll see here, sometimes we have to get a little bit more specific, but we can deal with that. Okay, so when we get to the answer choices on these questions, they're not necessarily going to say premise, counter premise, conclusion, etc. Instead, they might use synonyms, but we want to be able to identify these synonyms with premise, counter premise, conclusion, etc. So if it says that a certain sentence provides support, provides evidence, supports the conclusion, that means that it is a premise. Conversely, if it says that it presents an objection, a counter argument, or opposes the conclusion, that means it's a counter premise. If it identifies a sentence as the argument, the position, the prediction, the main claim, etc., that means it's the conclusion. And we'll just note that you don't need to worry about identifying assumptions on these kind of questions. Why? Because if you think about it, they're asking about sentences that are highlighted, whereas assumptions are things that aren't in there. They're implied, but they're not directly stated. So if we're talking about highlighted sentences, we're not going to be talking about assumptions. So our strategy here, to read the passage and identify the conclusion, identify the premises and the counter premises, go through the answer choices, eliminating any of them for which even one part of the answer is wrong. We'll see what we mean by that in a second. And then select the choice that either matches your approximate answer or that remains standing after you've applied process of elimination to both parts of each answer. And again, by both parts, we mean the parts corresponding to the two sentences. So let's look at an example. Rain-soaked soil contains less oxygen than does drier soil. The roots of melon plants perform less efficiently under the low oxygen conditions present in rain-soaked soil. When the efficiency of melon roots is impaired, the roots do not supply sufficient amounts of the proper nutrients for the plants to perform photosynthesis at their usual levels. It follows that melon plants have a lower than usual rate of photosynthesis when their roots are in rain-soaked soil. When the photosynthesis of the plants slows, sugar stored in the fruits is drawn off to supply the plants with energy. Therefore, ripe melons harvested after a prolonged period of heavy rain should be less sweet than other ripe melons. So using our tried and true approach here, we've got our conclusion at the end. The previous sentence is a premise because, well, if we have a therefore, what that means is a conclusion is being based on what has just been stated, and so at the very least, the previous sentence will function as a premise. This sentence here in blue is also a premise. When the efficiency of melon roots is impaired, the roots do not supply sufficient amounts of the proper nutrients for the plants to perform photosynthesis at their usual levels. This sentence in gray is also a premise. The roots of melon plants perform less efficiently under the low oxygen conditions present in rain-soaked soil. And this gray sentence is yet another premise. So we saved that one for last because you've got the little it follows that. That might throw some readers off, cause some to assume that this is going to represent a conclusion. But it's not a conclusion in the sense of being the conclusion of the passage. It's not what the passage is arguing. It's an intermediate conclusion. In other words, it is something that is being deduced based on points that were previously made, but then the argument continues to build on it as it approaches its actual conclusion. So that's what we mean by an intermediate conclusion. So intermediate conclusion is a type of premise relative to the overall conclusion. So we turn to the answer choices. Our approximate answer is just that the first is a premise, the second is a premise, or perhaps we can get more specific and say it's an intermediate conclusion. The first states the conclusion of the argument as a whole. No. So again, remember that we've got two-part answer choices. Both parts have to be correct. So if even one part is incorrect, the whole thing is incorrect. So A is going to be incorrect. B, the first provides support for the conclusion of the argument as a whole. That's correct because providing support for the conclusion, that's what a premise is. But notice the second part here. The second provides evidence that supports an objection to that conclusion. Nope. The second does not support an objection to the conclusion. It supports an intermediate conclusion in support of the overall conclusion. So B is incorrect. C, the first provides support for an intermediate conclusion that supports a further conclusion stated in the argument. The second states that intermediate conclusion. Well, bingo. something that provides support for an intermediate conclusion, we could say that this is a premise relative to that intermediate conclusion, but it's also a premise relative to the overall conclusion. It's kind of like one is nested inside the other. The intermediate conclusion is nested inside the overall conclusion. Something that's a premise of the intermediate conclusion is a premise of the overall conclusion by extension. But let's look at D and E just to see what they look like. So D, the first serves as an intermediate conclusion. Nope. The first one is not an intermediate conclusion. It supports an intermediate conclusion. So we can eliminate that one. And then E, the first states the position that the argument as a whole opposes. No. So even though the second part of that is correct, doesn't matter because the first part is incorrect. So we want to remember that we're going to encounter some half-right answers here. Don't dwell on the half that's right. Focus on the half that's wrong, because if half of it's wrong, the whole thing is wrong. So let's look at a second example. It is generally true, at least in this state, that lawyers who advertise a specific service charge less for that service than lawyers who do not advertise. It is also true that each time restrictions on the advertising of legal services have been eliminated, the number of lawyers advertising their services has increased and legal costs to customers have declined in consequence or as a result. So these might seem like premises so far, but we see this important signal word here, however. So however, eliminating the state requirement that legal advertisements must specify fees for specific services would almost certainly increase rather than further reduce customers' legal costs. So if these are premises, this would be a counter premise and then vice versa, but we haven't seen the conclusion, so we don't know which is which. Lawyers would no longer have an incentive to lower their fees when they begin advertising, and if no longer required to specify fee arrangements, many lawyers who now advertise would increase their fees. So let's just go right to it. So the last sentence is the conclusion, or the last half of the last sentence. If no longer required to specify fee arrangements, many lawyers who now advertise would increase their fees. The part in green is one premise. Lawyers would no longer have an incentive to lower their fees when they begin advertising. So that supports this conclusion. And then the part in blue also supports it, eliminating the state requirement that legal advertisements must specify fees for specific services would increase rather than reduce customers' legal costs. Why would that be so? Well, that's just something that the author is stating in the process of building to the conclusion. So that's a premise. And then given that these two are premises, these would then be counter premises because they are pushing in a different direction. Basically, the author of the passage is saying, okay, this is true. This other thing is true. But despite that, these other things are really going to be more important. They're going to outweigh these factors, and it's going to lead lawyers to increase their fees. So we turn our attention to the answer choices, again, with the idea that the first of the two sentences is a counter premise and the second one is a conclusion. So the first is a generalization that the author accepts as true. Well, it is, but we want to think about the role that it actually plays in the argument. And what's important here is not so much that the author accepts it as true, but the author proceeds in spite of the fact that it's true. The second part of this one, the second is presented as a consequence that follows from the truth of that generalization. So that's incorrect. Given that this is a counter premise, the conclusion doesn't follow from it. It follows in spite of it. So A is not going to be correct. B, the first is a pattern of cause and effect that the author argues will be repeated. No. We can go ahead and eliminate that. We could look at the second part if we wanted, but we don't need to because we eliminated it based on the first part. C, the first is a pattern of cause and effect that the author predicts will not hold in the case at issue. The second offers a consideration in support of that prediction. So while the first part of this might have seemed tempting, the second part is what will allow us to eliminate this one because the second is the conclusion, therefore it's not supporting anything else in the passage. Rather, other parts of the passage are supporting it. D, the first is evidence that the author offers in support of a prediction. The second, well, no, because the first one, again, is a counter premise. So that leaves us with E. The first acknowledges a consideration that weighs against the main position. In other words, it's a counter premise. The second is that position. In other words, it's the conclusion. So that is our correct answer. So what we've seen in looking at these argument-based passages and argument-based questions is that all of these tasks go together. In other words, Regardless of whether the question asks you about sentence roles or not, you want to make sure that you are paying attention to the role that each sentence plays. Likewise, regardless of whether the question asks you to specifically identify an assumption or not, you want to get in the habit of thinking about assumptions that the argument is making and relying on, because when you encounter questions about strengthening or weakening an argument, thinking about assumptions that the argument relies on is an important part of making your way to the answer. So again, the only question type where you don't need to specifically think about assumptions would be these questions that ask you to identify sentence roles, because again, assumptions will never be on the page. Those are things you have to, assumptions by definition are unstated, and these questions ask you to identify actual statements in the passage.